So let's go ahead and start this class on the 8 Pillars of Joy. Since we aren't at the center and don't have the prayer books, we'll just start with the refuge verse, which most of you know. So we'll do that once in English and then twice in the Tibetan. I go for refuge until I am enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. Sangye chodang soki choknam la jangchu bardu dakni kyabsu chi daki chanyen gipe sonam gi dola penchir sangye drupar shog. Sangye chodang soki choknam la jangchu bardu dakni kyabsu chi Daki Chanyan Gipe Sonam Gi Drola Penchir Sangye Drupar Sho. Okay, then let's just do a short meditation together. We'll just have an opportunity to focus the mind by working with the breath for a few minutes in silence. And then after that, I'll lead you in a short reflection to set your motivation for tonight. So let's go ahead and just find a good meditation posture, and you can work with the breath in whatever way suits your mind. If you don't have a technique that you use with the breath, you can just tune into the sensation at the tip of the nose and making that your meditation object. Just try to stay present with the breath as best as you can. So we'll go ahead and begin that part of the meditation, and certainly just be vigilant, paying attention, making sure that if you wander away from the breath, you bring the mind back to the breath. And then after a few minutes in silence, I'll lead you in a short meditation to set motivation. So I'll ring a chime to begin that. So now that our minds are a bit more focused, let's generate a good motivation for being here and engaging in this teaching on the topic of gratitude. And although we haven't yet discussed it, maybe we can begin with just a short reflection on the things that we can be very grateful for in our lives. So we have the opportunity in this life to meet with so many wonderful things, and we have certainly all of us met with the teachings of the Dalai Lama through his incredible kindness, especially this Book of Joy that he co-wrote with Archbishop Desmond Tutu, Douglas Abrams, all the people that were involved in putting those talks together so that we can engage in this study and practice of these 8 pillars of joy. This is one place to start with our gratitude, is having the gratitude for everything that has led us to be here tonight in terms of the teachings we're going to be looking at. But moreover, we can also be grateful for so many other factors that have played into our being here right now. And the kindness of Lama Yeshe and Lama Zopa, who began the FPMT, which our center is a part of. We can be grateful for all the people who have made the center possible through their efforts, through their kindness, generosity. Be grateful for all the other teachers that we have access to through the center being there. And of course, grateful for all the other things we have in our lives that contribute to our welfare. Grateful for the houses we have over the roof over our heads and so on, the cars that we're able to drive, the roads that we drive on, the food that we eat, the clothes we wear, the books we read. All of these things we can have immense gratitude for. And just so spend another minute or so thinking about everything that you are grateful for in your life, and try to observe if some feeling of joy arises with that thought of gratitude. And then from that place of gratitude, generate this motivation that is recognizing all the good fortune that we currently possess, but moreover, wanting to make the best use of this. Now that we have received so much kindness from others, may we be able to return that kindness through what we're doing here tonight, looking at these teachings, trying to enhance the practice of gratitude, the feeling of connection to others that comes about through our gratitude, the feeling of joy that we can then share with others, and have that other-oriented motivation to think that you're here, yes, to achieve these things for yourself, but primarily so that then you can become a source of them for others, to help others to have these same qualities, these same 8 pillars in their lives, and thereby experience great joy. So we're here for the joy and the welfare of all beings. Okay, so thank you all for joining tonight. Again, we'll see how this works out with this first class that we're doing this Zoom session with. So we've been working with the 8 pillars of joy. Again, these are set out as part of the Book of Joy, His Holiness and Archbishop Desmond Tutu's dialogues that they had in Dharamsala, India, some years ago. And the 8 pillars being kind of things that were identified by these 2 great masters that would be the sources of joy. Joy is coming about as a byproduct when we practice all of these. So we've already looked at the first 4 that had to do with kind of changing our minds, the mental states, by changing our perspective, having a shift in our perspective away from those things that are more inhibiting and keep us disconnected to those that enlarge our view and help us to feel connected to others. We also looked at humility, which is the ability to not think of ourselves quite as much, and to think of others and reduce our arrogance, our pride, our feeling of superiority. And then humor, how we connect to others through seeing our shared humanity and the foibles, the faults that we all possess, and our ability to connect with others from that level. And then finally, the fourth one, which was our acceptance, the ability to kind of embrace our life in all of the various facets of it, whether it be the painful moments or the pleasurable moments or the neutral moments, whatever it is that we have, to have some level of acceptance. So those 4 mental attitudes we spent 4 sessions on. The first of the next set of 4 that have to do with qualities of the heart, we spent 2 sessions on. We looked at forgiveness being a really big topic, the process of reclaiming our peace of mind by letting go of our anger, our resentment, and by virtue of that, we can also hopefully extend that forgiveness to others. They can become beneficiaries of that attitude and that action. But we primarily do forgiveness for ourselves, recognizing that we're holding on to the pain and staying connected to those people who have harmed us by continuing to not forgive them. And of course, we also want to begin often with forgiving ourselves to learn how to adopt that attitude so that we can then extend that to others. And at the end of the last class, I did talk about the 2 techniques that we mentioned for engaging in forgiveness. One was the fourfold path of forgiveness that's in the book. I don't have it in front of me here, but the Book of Forgiving, which was written by Archbishop Desmond Tutu and his daughter Mpo. And that set out the idea of sort of telling one story, naming the hurt, extending forgiveness, and then either renewing or relinquishing the relationship depending upon where one is at. Then we also talked a little bit about Jack Kornfield's forgiveness meditation that is a bit more in the Buddhist vein. Jack Kornfield's meditation covers 3 ideas. The first being forgiving oneself for one's own faults and misbehavior, things that we've done that we do have some regret for. And then secondly, the practice of seeking forgiveness from others. This again can be extended to actually doing that, but it can even be on one's own cushion, just making the determination to work with that idea. What is it like to seek forgiveness of others? And then finally, the third one, which is forgiving others for the faults that they've done that have injured us or those that we love. So these are the 2 main techniques, and Sarah, thank you very much for sending those out to everyone in the Ksitigarbha group by email. I'm curious if people wanted to share anything in terms of their own experience working with forgiveness, if they had a chance to do that. So again, all of you are probably having your mics muted at this point, but you can unmute your mic if you wanted to share anything, and I'll see if that's the case. You also can use a chat box. Most of you may have noticed that Zoom has an opportunity with the little icon you can press on that says chat, and you can write at any time in that box, and I'll be happy to get to those questions or comments as I see them, and I'm able to address them. But did anyone have anything they wanted to share in terms of forgiveness before we continue on? Okay. So let's go ahead and start our process of looking at gratitude. So again, with the Zoom, one of the things that's nice is it does allow you to share screens. And so I do have my normal PowerPoint presentation that I put together, and I was reviewing this today, and I even added a few things and changed a few things. So hopefully you'll find that useful. So we may not be, you might not see my face a lot of the time because we'll be doing mostly the slides, but I'll come in occasionally just to sort of check in um, and do that. So let me go ahead and pull up for now the screen that's going to help us to do this. We want to do the slideshow from here. Okay, so I think everyone should be able to see that now. What I'm doing is kind of taking off the faces there so that I think what you're seeing probably is just the slideshow. So this is the little cartoon or graphic that I put together found for this one. As I've mentioned previously, I like to throw in one of these just to start the discussion. And it's from 2 of my favorite childhood characters, Winnie the Pooh and Piglet. And so A. A. Milne says in one of the books, I don't know if this is the first one or House at Pooh Corner or what, he says, Piglet noticed that even though he had a very small heart, it could hold a rather large amount of gratitude. And this idea behind gratitude is that we're not really restricted in terms of what we can do with gratitude. Gratitude can be extended to so many things, and we're going to discuss some of the challenges of things that we want to be grateful for. But nonetheless, gratitude is very expansive and doesn't have any boundaries or limits in terms of what we can be grateful for in our lives. Certainly things that may help us generally, but even those things that hinder us to some degree can be seen as objects of gratitude. And we'll talk about that tonight. So again, I've got some quotes from the Book of Joy, and the very first one is at the beginning of that chapter on gratitude. This is the Dalai Lama talking, saying, "Every day, think as you wake up, I am fortunate to be alive. I have a precious human life. I am not going to waste it. So this is, again, a concept that we have in Tibetan Buddhism. Certainly, this is one of the preliminary meditations on the stages of the path, is to have that idea of seeing this life as very precious, very wonderful in terms of the opportunity that it presents and the ability for us to use it in a very powerful way. So the topic, it says here, was gratitude, and it was fascinating to see how often the Archbishop and the Dalai Lama stopped to express their gratitude for each other, for all who were making their time together possible, and for each and everything that they were witnessing. So this is, again, just how these two embody each of these 8 pillars in terms of their own gratitude for what led them to be there and what allowed them to engage in this conversation on these various topics. So the next slide is Douglas Abrams, who was, again, the main author of the text in terms of assembling what these two people said. It says, neither the Archbishop nor the Dalai Lama spent a great deal of time talking about enjoyment. And by this he means kind of sensory enjoyment, the pleasurable things that we engage in. Perhaps because both of their traditions are skeptical of finding lasting happiness through sensual indulgence. But I had been happy to find that neither of them was opposed to the pleasures permitted in their spiritual lives, whether Tibetan rice pudding, which is what His Holiness would be enamored of, or rum raisin ice cream, which I assume is what the Archbishop likes to have. So again, this is true in our tradition. We don't really look at these objects of sensual indulgence as being, and something that we embrace as a real source of happiness and well-being. They give transitory pleasure, but they're not something we can rely upon, and moreover, they can often cause us to have great attachment. But nonetheless, we still can enjoy them. We still can have those transitory experiences as long as we understand them in the correct light. So they still have a gratitude, obviously, for those. So he went on then, Douglas Abrams, to talk about how he sees gratitude. And we'll talk about other elements of gratitude before we get into discussing the rest of the book. But he says, gratitude is the elevation of enjoyment, kind of taking beyond what we normally call enjoyment by virtue of the 6 senses and so on, or the 5 senses, but to actually elevate it to the idea of an ennobling of enjoyment, as it says here, making enjoyment even more profound. Gratitude, he says, is one of the key dimensions that Paul Ekman, you might remember Paul Ekman from the very first class, where we talked about the different elements involved in joy. And he says that Ekman lists in his definition of joy, gratitude as one of them. And so I repeated that from an earlier slide where I had set those all out, all these different ideas around gratitude. And here he defined it as the appreciation of a selfless act of which one is the beneficiary. I mean, obviously gratitude has many more dimensions than that. But oftentimes it is gratitude for the things that we have received, for things that others have done for us, that we feel very happy about, that we can really take some pleasure in, that others have contributed to our welfare. So this is, again, one way of looking at gratitude. Continues and says, gratitude is the recognition of all that holds us in the web of life and all that has made it possible to have the life that we have and the moment that we are experiencing. Thanksgiving is a natural response to life and may be the only way to savor it. So this is the theme and the ideas behind gratitude. And we'll get into what is said by those who've researched into gratitude on a scientific level, but this element of recognition is a key part of it. When we recognize everything that has contributed to our welfare, then we have the space for gratitude for all the various things that have made it possible for us to have any particular moment or the experiences that we are having. And to have that idea of giving thanks, therefore, is a way to savor it, to make it actually much deeper, so that the pleasure isn't fleeting and temporary, but actually becomes much more profound. Douglas Abrams goes on to say, both Christian and Buddhist traditions, perhaps even all spiritual traditions, recognize the importance of gratefulness. It allows us to shift our perspective, as the Dalai Lama and the Archbishop counseled, toward all we have been given and all that we have. It moves us away from the narrow-minded focus on fault and lack and to the wider perspective of benefit and abundance. So it's kind of interesting that they go back to even the first pillar of perspective in this little quote here, this idea from Douglas Abrams, because gratitude is based on shifting one's perspective. But remember how we talked about that very first pillar of perspective is the foundation for everything else that happens. We have to kind of move away from our limited, narrow views of things, our self-centered focus and so on, to something that's much wider and more encompassing of other beings. And so gratitude is a good example of when that perspective manifests in terms of recognizing everything in our life that contributes to our welfare. So according to, this is my own little thing that I put together based on this guy, Robert Emmons, I mentioned earlier, people who've researched gratitude, and he actually is said to be one of the world's leading scientific experts on gratitude. And there are two components, he says, for his definition of gratitude, which he says arise from two stages of information processing. The first is affirmation, and the second is recognition. So let's look at how he describes those. He says, first, it's an affirmation of goodness. We affirm that there are good things in the world, gifts and benefits we've received. This doesn't mean that life is perfect. It doesn't ignore complaints, burdens, and hassles. But when we look at life as a whole, gratitude encourages us to identify some amount of goodness in our life. So this is the first element of it, and there's kind of this affirmation that there is goodness in our lives, goodness in the world, that we are the recipient of so much that has contributed to our welfare and our well-being. Continuing on this to the second part, the recognition, the second part of gratitude is figuring out where that goodness comes from. We recognize the sources of this goodness as being outside of ourselves. It didn't stem from anything we necessarily did ourselves in which we might take pride. Of course, in Buddhism, we do hold that what we receive from others is a karma ripening from what we have done for them and to them. But nonetheless, in a real sort of I don't know, kind of conventional way, we can say that, yes, other people are taking the initiative to do things that we benefit from. So in a way, it doesn't have as much to do with ourselves as with the interrelationship, that dynamic that other people are involved in our own goodness that we've come to appreciate. So continuing on this, Robert Emmons says, we can appreciate positive traits in ourselves, but I think true gratitude involves a humble dependence on others. We acknowledge that other people, or even higher powers if you're of a spiritual mindset, gave us many gifts, big and small, to help us achieve the goodness in our lives. So this is, again, the idea that while we can be grateful for many things that I guess have some self-gratitude for the things that we've done for ourselves or for others or what have you, the real gratitude, a true gratitude, involves this humility that we recognize our dependence on others. So this sounds familiar, right? Because throughout this course, we've also been touching on that concept of interdependence. It's through interdependence that we can see the need for humility. It's through interdependence that we can see the need for a wider perspective because we are all involved in each other's welfare. And so this is, again, a common theme that Buddhism teaches, but obviously other traditions and other mindsets are certainly embracing this concept that we are involved in each other's welfare to a great degree. We're certainly seeing this in terms of our current climate crisis and things going on in the world where we are all kind of in it together, having created it together. So Robert Emmons then, in this article that I'm quoting from, goes on to answer the question, but what good is gratitude? By saying that although there are many reasons why gratitude has such a positive transformative impact on people, there are four to highlight. So he's going to go through these four. I'm just going to put them all up at one time and talk about them a little bit. The first one is that gratitude allows us to celebrate the present. So he talks about, as a scientist who's been investigating positive emotions, he essentially says that our positive emotions wear off quickly. Our emotional systems actually like newness, they like novelty, they like change. This is why in our culture there's so much emphasis on getting a new car, getting a new phone, getting a new this, a new that. And so we tend to get our positive feedback by getting something new. But gratitude actually makes us appreciate the value of something. And when we have an appreciation for that, then we extract more benefits from it. We're less likely to take it for granted. It allows us to more fully participate in life. Instead of adapting to goodness, he says, we celebrate goodness. So this is the idea behind this first one. We really are able to celebrate the present, celebrate the goodness we have right now, and not get so caught up in that orientation of wanting, desiring something new to come along. Oftentimes, if we really spend a lot of time in gratitude, we find that some of that diminishes our tendency to look for something else because we appreciate what we have. We become much more content in the moment. The second one might seem kind of obvious because if the gratitude allows the more positive experience of being in the moment and celebrating it, gratitude blocks the toxic negative emotions which could be arising in those moments. He points out in particular things like envy, resentment, regret, all these emotions that can destroy our happiness, that can keep us bound up in these little cycles of just strengthening those envious thoughts or thoughts of wanting to harm others and so on. Gratitude is also said by this psychologist, Alex Wood, in the Journal of Research in Personality, has indicated there was a 2008 study that he did that showed that gratitude can even reduce the frequency and duration of episodes of depression. So it has a very powerful impact on us because while we have gratitude present in our minds, these negative emotions don't have any space. We know this from our Buddhist practice, right? This is why we practice more positive emotions. When loving kindness towards others is present, we can't possibly have thoughts of anger, hatred towards them. So these positive emotions, such as gratitude, block the toxic negative ones that we are combating all the time in Buddhism. The third point, in terms of a reason why we can say gratitude is good, why it's positive and helpful, is that grateful people are more stress resistant. Which makes some sense too, right? If we are embracing our life to that degree and that fullness with this mind of gratitude and appreciation, then in the face of any sort of serious trauma that we face, any adversity that we have to endure, we have an ability to recover more quickly, to not be as stressed out, because the grateful disposition leads us to have a perspective from which we can even interpret the negative experiences we have in a different way. And we can guard ourselves against any of these stressful after effects, PTSD and what have you. All of these can be diminished to some degree, and we can be more stress resistant if we practice gratitude. The fourth one is that grateful people have a higher sense of self-worth. And I'll quote him on here. He says, "I think that's because when you're grateful, you have the sense that someone else is looking out for you. Someone else has provided for your well-being, or you notice a network of relationships, past and present, of people who are responsible for helping you get to where you are right now. And once you start to recognize the contributions that other people have made to your life, once you realize that other people have seen the value in you, you can then transform the way you see yourself." Kind of makes sense that when we see that so many people have contributed to our welfare, we feel kind of better about ourselves to some degree. Not that we're going to induce this pride and arrogance, but that we elevate some sense of self-worth, of an ability to see ourselves through that lens. So I'm sharing these tonight newly. I haven't shared these in previous courses on the 8 Pillars of Joy because when I was doing my research this afternoon, I found these, and I think they're actually really quite good and give us more impetus that wasn't in the book. Maybe we don't need to highlight some of these because we probably understand them already from our Buddhist practice, but it is interesting that this researcher on gratitude has actually found some of these things that very much mirror what we find in our Buddhist practice, especially the first two, allowing us to have more positive attitudes in the moment, which therefore then also blocks any of the toxic negative emotions that we're trying to curtail in our practice. So then there's one more quote that I thought I have shared this before. This is Melody Beatty, who is an author who's written on codependency and a number of other things. A nice little quote from her where she says, "Gratitude unlocks the fullness of life. It turns what we have into enough and more. It turns denial into acceptance, chaos into order, confusion into clarity. It turns problems into gifts, failures into success, the unexpected into perfect timing, and mistakes into important events. Gratitude makes sense of our past, brings peace for today, and creates a vision for tomorrow." So This is all the kind of like advertising for gratitude to some degree through what the book said, as well as these additional quotes that I've shared. What we're going to do for the remainder of our time then is talk about the aspects of gratitude that were discussed in the book. Again, some of what we already covered isn't really discussed in as much detail. Rather, they begin by looking at this idea of gratitude for the opportunity that life affords us. And in this part, we're going to especially look at this idea that Brother David Stundle-Rast puts forward of kind of having this gratitude for each and every moment because it's ripe with opportunity. Really kind of a nice thought. And then gratitude for life's difficulties and then for one's enemies. These two challenging things, how do we have gratitude in those cases? If we are embracing those, is there room for us to have this positive emotion of gratitude? And we'll be exploring that, of course, in our Tibetan Buddhist practice of kind of transforming our suffering into happiness that we discussed earlier in the pillar of acceptance. We can see that there is that possibility that is entertained. Then the fourth point, we just talked about forgiveness as the first of the four pillars of the heart. We're going to do, they do talk in a bit in the book about gratitude and forgiveness and how these two are kind of correlated, especially after one looks at gratitude for one's enemies. We can perhaps see some link between those two. Then a fifth point, how gratitude actually connects us, brings us together. Gratitude and overcoming negative bias is one of the last topics they deal with. And again, I'll get into that, but we all have some negative bias that's not quite hardwired into our biology, but it is certainly, I mean, we do talk about the fight or flight response and things like that. We're sort of hardwired to some degree to be responsive to the things that are wrong in our world. And gratitude helps us to adjust that attitude, that negative bias that we might have. So these are the topics that I'll be talking about. So what I'll do for tonight, by the way, rather than normally when we have class, I usually do a break halfway through or so. But tonight, I think what I'll do is I'll just keep going. So we might end up a little bit earlier, but since we're not together at the center, I don't know that it makes sense to have a break. If someone feels opposite, you can put something in the chat box and we'll take that into consideration. But the very first topic, gratitude for the opportunity life affords us. So maybe before I go into this, let me stop the share for here because I do want to talk a little bit about Brother David. Um, so I did have the opportunity to meet Brother David Stundle-Rast. Many of you have heard of him. He is a Benedictine monk, I think is the tradition he comes from in the Catholic tradition. And in 1992, this was right after my first partner had died in August, and I decided that I needed to have some healing time. And so I went down to Esalen. Many of you know of Esalen, down in Big Sur. Beautiful place to spend some time. And rather than take one of their courses that was really involved in a lot of psychology or other things, I decided to take one that was called kind of spirituality in nature. And I thought, because my partner and I, we used to go backpacking a lot and be out in outdoors. And I thought it'd be really healing for me to do something that was a course designed to get me out in nature and what have you. And it was October, just beginning of fall in Big Sur. It was really beautiful, amazing experience. One of the nights after we had had our day out, doing our hike and what have you, we were in the common room there where everyone eats, the dining room at Esalen. And I sat down with the man, I don't remember his name right now, who led that week-long workshop. And he introduced me to Brother David. And of course, I didn't say anything about what was going on for me, what I was experiencing. And we conversed a little bit. But at one point, the man who was leading the retreat asked Brother David, because Brother David's quite knowledgeable, he said, "Brother David, would you share a poem with us?" And I said, "Well, that sounds good. Yeah, please share a poem." And anyway, what Brother David shared was this wonderful little poem. Let me see if I want to make sure I don't mess up the reading of it. So let me make sure that I've got 'cause it's very easy to get one or two words wrong, even though it's quite short. So let me see if I can find where I put that. It turned out to be a little poem that is by the poet W.S. Merwin. Most of you have heard of W.S. Merwin. And this poem goes like this. Let me see if I can find it. I knew I wrote it on one of these, but I don't see it right now. I'll have to do it from memory. And if I screw up the words, I apologize to W.S. Merwin. He passed away a few years ago, but anyway, I apologize for doing that. But the poem is called Separation. And this is what Brother David said to me as sharing a poem. He said, "Your absence has gone through me like thread through a needle. Everything I see is stitched with your color." So this was what he shared with me. I mean, not knowing that I had just gone through losing my partner, that I was grieving, that I was trying to heal from that. And this poem of separation really touched me because um, I had never kind of had that encapsulated in such an interesting sentiment. Those of you, and I'm sure most of you have gone through some grieving at one time or another, know that that's what happens, is that when we lose someone, we feel that everything that we see, everything we do, everything we're involved with is stitched with their color. It has kind of they're there with that experience because of the presence, the prominence of grief. At least this is how I understood that poem. So Brother David, I think, is a pretty amazing being. I don't know, I really was quite touched with him. He's written a number of books on what he calls gratefulness. He really likes this word gratefulness as opposed to gratitude. And I think there's something to be said for that, because when we talk about being grateful, full of gratitude, it kind of has a different connotation than just simply gratitude. So gratefulness, he's written a number of books on, and as well as a number of other subjects. And so I just thought I would share a little bit of my own story with Brother David for what it's worth. I don't claim to have any great, experience or relationship with Brother David, but so let's go back then to, somehow it didn't stay with the slideshow. Let me go forward here. There we go. Let me get to sharing from the, okay, so everyone should be seeing it now then, this slide once more with what we have from the book. Brother David Standelrast, a Catholic Benedictine monk and scholar who spent a great deal of time in Christian Buddhist interfaith dialogue, has explained, it is not happiness that makes us grateful. It is gratefulness that makes us happy. This is very much in line with what this whole book has been talking about, right? The 8 pillars as being those things that we engage in whereby joy is a byproduct. Our natural sort of state of happiness and well-being is heightened when we practice in these various ways. And gratitude, I think, is a very obvious one that induces extreme joy, a really joyful attitude. And this is Brother David. You can hear him speaking in these words. Every moment is a gift. There is no certainty that you will not have another moment with all the opportunity it contains. The gift within every gift is the opportunity it affords us. So the gift within every moment then is that opportunity that it offers us. Most often it is the opportunity to enjoy it, but sometimes a difficult gift is given to us. And that can be an opportunity to rise to the challenge. This is what we're going to be looking at in terms of this concept of transforming, working with our difficulties with a sense of gratitude. But this is a really precious thought, that in every moment there's this incredible gift because of the opportunity that it offers us. I like this idea because it can transform how we see every moment of our day. The Dalai Lama's ability, this is Douglas Abrams talking, to be grateful for the opportunities that exist, even in exile, was a profound shift in perspective, allowing him not only to accept the reality of his circumstances, but also to see the opportunity in every experience. Acceptance, which we talked about as the 4th pillar, recall that was one of them of the mind. Acceptance means not fighting reality. Gratitude means embracing reality. It means moving from counting your burdens to counting your blessings, as the Archbishop had recommended, both as an antidote to envy and a recipe for appreciating our own lives. So this is kind of an elevation again of acceptance, taking it beyond just accepting what one has and actually being grateful for what one has, even when we have things coming into our lives that we don't desire, that can bring us some pain or difficulty. Brother David again is talking here saying, whatever life gives to you, you can respond with joy. Joy is the happiness that does not depend on what happens. It is the grateful response to the opportunity that life offers you at this moment. So this is, again, a framework. I do like how perspective keeps getting tied into gratefulness or gratitude, because it is a way of looking at life. It is a way of being able to embrace everything that we experience from a different vantage point, rather than just things that are happening to us. We can see them as precious opportunities for us to grow, to develop, to experience more joy, to create more space, more room in our hearts. So this is a really powerful thoughts, I think, in this first part of that chapter when Brother David is called to mind. And we're going to see Brother David again later in the talk on gratitude in terms of a practice that he recommends for us to engage in. The second part is gratitude for life's difficulties. Maybe I'll stop it here just to see if there were any comments from anybody. Once again, if you do have your mic muted, you're welcome to unmute if you want to add something to it. I do have comments here that somebody was just asking maybe people would want to block their video, but I don't know. I'm not that opposed to that. Sometimes for me as the teacher, it helps if the video is there because then I can see people and see some registration of faces. But if you don't want to be sort of online with your picture there, then you can certainly block that. Is everything okay with the quality? One comment from Laura earlier was it seems that the speed is fluctuating. And I don't know if that's the case or not. I don't have the best connection here in terms of internet at home, but hopefully it's been good enough for everyone.
Yeah, for the most part, it's been good.
Okay.
Yeah, it's improved. Yeah, it's got better.
It's better. Okay, good. All right. Any comments from anyone on what we talked about so far in terms of gratitude? All right, so let's go ahead and go back then to the slides. And we'll do it from this second topic, which is on gratitude for life's difficulties. So this is the Dalai Lama speaking now, saying, even suffering helps you to develop empathy and compassion for others. Exile really has brought me closer to reality. When you are in difficult situations, there is no room for pretense. In adversity or tragedy, you must confront reality as it is. So he's beginning to highlight this concept, which again, we're quite familiar with in Tibetan Buddhism, that our suffering experiences, our difficult experiences are actually amazing opportunities for learning, especially as he says here, to develop greater empathy and compassion for others, to open up to their suffering, to see us as not alone in our own suffering, and by virtue of that, really improve the quality of our lives. Compassion is coming up as one of the other pillars of the heart. It's the next one on our list of the four, and then we'll end up with generosity. But the idea is that all of these qualities can be enhanced if we're grateful for the moment, even if it is a suffering moment, even if it is a moment that really challenges us. When you are a refugee, he says, when you have lost your land, you cannot pretend or hide behind your role. When you are confronted with the reality of suffering, all of life is laid bare. Even a king, when he is suffering, cannot pretend to be something special. He's just one human being, suffering like all other people. So we see once more that theme of kind of our shared humanity coming through in this, which was part of humility, part of humor, that root word of humus, which means earth, that we're all on the same earth, we're all on the same ground. So once more, if we embrace those experiences of difficulty, we can learn so much about our common predicament that we have with other beings, that we're not unique in our own suffering. So then the Archbishop is talked about here in terms of difficulties, because he's certainly seen his as well, but he actually talks about Nelson Mandela. He says the Archbishop described earlier in the week how Nelson Mandela had been transformed while he was in prison. Mandela and his fellow political prisoners had used their time to develop their mind and their character so that they would someday be ready to rule the country. They had seen it as an informal university. So I do see this to some degree with people who I work with in prison, but it's a hard one because most people in prison don't see it as that. They see it as kind of biding their time until they're released from prison. And in that way, it becomes a very challenging, difficult experience for them. But if you look at it as a university that you are now enrolled in, and you're going to learn from the difficulties you experience in prison, then you can really transform. Many of you might remember that story that Venerable Rabina shares. She read an article in Vogue or something. It was an interview with a woman who had been falsely convicted of aiding and abetting in a crime that ended up with a murder of a storekeeper or something. These people they'd pick them up hitchhiking, her and her husband, and they went in and robbed this store, and they were convicted along with the couple that did the actual crime of. Um, so anyway, the point behind Venerable Rabina's story was that this woman was imprisoned, and she realized, although she's falsely imprisoned and she can still work for reversing that decision, she had to accept her predicament. She couldn't, you know, she said, I'm going to take this as my time in retreat, and I'm going to use this to work on myself and to develop more abilities and skills and qualities. And it was a huge transformation for her. And I'm sure, Nelson Mandela the same. They could have gone into prison and hardened their minds and their hearts, but they chose to actually make it into something that would prepare them to be better capable when they got out of prison to be able to rule the country, which he did. Um, so in Buddhism, as it says here, this is going on to the topic of one's enemies, which is one of the difficulties that we face, is those people who challenge us. Here it says, in Buddhism, one can be grateful even for one's enemies, even for that most difficult person, which we would call our most precious spiritual teachers, because they help us develop our spiritual practice and to cultivate equanimity even in the face of adversity. The Dalai Lama's story about his friend losing his compassion for his torturers in the Chinese Gulag was a poignant example. So he just mentions the example, Douglas Abrams, but I found online a recounting of that story. Some of you have heard this story before, but I think it's worth sharing. And it was from a talk that the Dalai Lama gave at Millennium Park on genuine compassion. And he says, this is a recounting of it. He says, then the Dalai Lama explained how the Chinese attitude changed in the 1950s and that there is still serious danger toward Tibetans and their religion today, especially with the influx of ethnic Chinese into Tibet. So then this is the Dalai Lama talking. He says, the news from Tibet is very sad, but with mental training, I can keep peace of mind. To illustrate his point, he told a story about a Tibetan monk who spent many years in the Chinese Gulag and later went on to India after having been released. This is His Holiness talking. He said he faced danger a few times. What danger? I asked of him. Of losing compassion toward the Chinese, the monk replied. I mean, this is, when we hear these sorts of things, it sounds so outrageous, because if we were imprisoned for even a week under the conditions that they have in the prisons in Tibet that the Chinese run, we would probably be crazy with rage by the end of it. And these great practitioners who had the ability to come into that situation and actually use it as an opportunity to develop their compassion, well, then it is coming from some level of gratitude. It has to be coming from some embracing of whatever one is experiencing, even if it's the inflicting of harm by one's enemies on oneself. It is important, His Holiness says, to keep compassion towards those who cause you disturbances. In spite of difficult life and hostile surroundings, an individual can keep peace of mind. So again, this is from the recounting of that same talk that he gave, where he mentioned this story. It was evocative to me of a quote that I sometimes use. It's not actually from the Book of Joy. It was Kahil Gibran, who many of you know, who's the writer of the Prophet, amazing practitioner in the Sufi tradition. He says, I have learned silence from the talkative, tolerance from the intolerant, and kindness from the unkind. Yet strange, I am ungrateful to these teachers. So this idea of one's enemies being someone that we can be grateful for, because they help us get these lessons. They help us to learn the power of silence from those who, talk our ear off, or, go on and on and on about things. The tolerance from those who have shown the intolerance towards others. The kindness from those who have not been that way towards their fellow human beings or animals and so on. And we can learn the opposite from them, but we don't have the gratitude towards those teachers that we would expect to have towards anyone else who has taught us. We might feel very grateful for the spiritual teachers, for example, that we've had in our lives, but we may have learned an awful lot from those people who are actually quite harmful to us and others. So in order to elaborate on that, I am going to tell this little story that comes from Edith Eva Eger's book. I had found a little picture of her on the internet there. I hope I get a chance someday to hear her talk. She's on the older side now because she was about 16 years old, I believe, 15, 16, for the time that she was in Auschwitz and the concentration camps, having been taken from Hungary to them in the late part of the war, 44, 45, just before Allied forces released them from the concentration camps. But she's a really inspirational person. So I'm going to stop the share there so I can share from her book, which I'll hold up for a minute. It's called The Choice, Embrace the Possible. And the story goes that when she was first brought into the concentration camps, that she had a meeting. There was a group of them that came in, and Dr. Mengele was there. Many of you know Joseph Mengele was called Dr. Death. It was the nickname they had for him, responsible for the death of so many Jewish people in the Holocaust. And Dr. Mengele asks Edith Eva Eger to dance for him. Apparently, she was a dancer back in Hungary. She danced ballet and was very familiar with, dance movements and that. And so, this is how she recounts this. This is beginning on page 40 of her book. Little dancer, Dr. Mengele says, dance for me. He directs the musicians to begin playing. The familiar opening strain of the Blue Danube Waltz filters into the dark, close room. Mengele's eyes bulge at me. I'm lucky. I know a routine to the Blue Danube that I can dance in my sleep. But my limbs are heavy, as in a nightmare when there's danger and you can't run away. Dance, he commands again, and I feel my body start to move. She goes on to describe a bit more of the dance, but to get to the more important part that's the setup for the final part, she says, as I dance, I discover a piece of wisdom that I have never forgotten. I will never know what miracle of grace allows me this insight. It will save my life many times, even after the horror is over. I can see that Dr. Mengele, the seasoned killer who just this morning murdered my mother, is more pitiful than me. I am free in my mind, which he can never be. He will always have to live with what he's done. He is more a prisoner than I am. As I close my routine with a final graceful split, I pray. But it isn't myself I pray for. I pray for him. I pray for his sake that he won't have the need to kill me. He must be impressed by my performance because he tosses me a loaf of bread. A loaf of bread. A gesture, as it turns out, that will later save my life. As evening turns to night, I share the bread with Magda, who was her sister, and our bunkmates. I am grateful to have bread. I am grateful to be alive. So this first expression of her gratitude is at the moment when all this is happening. Of course, she's just coming into the concentration camps. I'm sure has great fear, great trepidation, meets Dr. Mengele, has this experience, and she's given this loaf of bread that she shares with her bunkmates and with her sister. Jump forward now about a year, because this whole process of her being involved in the concentration camps, being there and what have you, was about a year long. She's now in the death march from Mauthausen to Gunskirchen. So she says, it is the shortest distance we have been forced to walk, but we are also weakened by then that only 100 out of the 2,000 of us will actually survive. Magda and I cling to each other, determined to stay together, to stay upright. Each hour, hundreds of girls fall into the ditches on either side of the road, too weak or too ill to keep moving. They're killed on the spot. We are like the head of a dandelion, gone to seed and blown by the wind, only a few white tufts remaining. Hunger is my only name. Every part of me is in pain. Every part of me is numb. I can't walk another step. I ache so badly I can't feel myself move. I am just a circuitry of pain, a signal that feeds back on itself. I don't know that I have stumbled until I feel the arms of Magda and the other girls lifting me. They have laced their fingers together to form a human chair. You shared your bread, one of them says. The words don't mean anything to me. When have I ever tasted bread? But then a memory rises up. Our first night at Auschwitz. Mengele ordering the music, and Mengele ordering me to dance. This body danced. This mind dreamt of the opera house. This body ate that bread. I am the one who had the thought that night and who thinks it again now. Mengele killed my mother. Mengele let me live. Now a girl who shared a crust with me nearly a year ago has recognized me. She uses her last strength to interlace her fingers with Magda's and those of the other girls and lift me up into the air. In a way, Mengele allowed this moment to happen. He didn't kill any of us that night or any night after. He gave us bread. So this story, I mean, when I first read this, I was bawling. I just, you know, it's a very powerful moment of realization that she came to, of recognizing that even her enemy, even Dr. Mengele, as horrific as this man was in terms of the actions he engaged in, again, I don't want to label him as horrific. He is a man who obviously had horrific thoughts, who had horrible conditions that led to him doing what he did. But she could see some sense of gratitude that because he spared her life and she gave that bread that one night, she created this connection with this other girl that was, you know, saved her life. They said that all the women who like sort of fell to the wayside were again either shot or just left behind to die because they weren't going to about, you know, nobody was about to carry anyone. But these women actually picked her up, carried her because of Mengele's kindness. So there is an opportunity to even see that, you know, our enemies, some of the people who challenge us the most, can actually be seen through the lens of gratitude. Takes a lot to work in that way. I'm not saying we all have it instantly, but once more, this is the opportunity that I think this affords us. So any comments on that, or anything that anyone else wants to share in terms of this idea of difficulties, enemies? Okay, let's go ahead then and go back to the slides. Oops, can do that. That'll get me right back to where I was. Anyway, like I said, I hope I get a chance someday to actually hear her talk. There are some videos of her out on YouTube if you're interested. But again, her book, I can't recommend it more. It was an amazing transformation that she went through. And it doesn't take all place in like her, you know, time in the concentration camps. That was kind of maybe 60 pages into it. There's a number of pages afterwards after she has been released, and her story after that and the transformation she goes through. So let's go on then to the next slide, if I can get it to go forward. On gratitude and forgiveness, this is the next topic. And so Douglas Abrams says these prison stories, especially the one, you know, again, of the Tibetans in prison in China and what have you, reminded me of a former inmate I've had the privilege of knowing. And Douglas Abrams here goes on then to tell the story of Anthony Ray Hinton, who spent over 30 years. Actually, maybe it's not over 30 years. I think that's what he says in his book. But when you read Anthony Ray Hinton's book, which is called The Sun Does Shine, I think it's a little less than 30 years. But nonetheless, he was spent all this time. I mean, it's still, whether it was 29 or 30 or 31 years, it's a long, long time to be on death row for a crime that you didn't commit. So the story goes, maybe I'll take it off here again when I'm talking about a story. It's kind of maybe useful to see my face, but the story of Anthony Ray Hinton is quite interesting. He's a black man who in Alabama was working on this particular night. And there had been a few crimes that had happened prior to this where people in these convenience stores were killed by somebody robbing them. And on that night, for the crime that he was arrested for, he was later charged with the other ones as well. But on that night, he was working in a locked facility. I mean, again, you would think you'd have an airtight alibi, right? Because you're there, you cannot leave there without someone knowing, because it's a locked facility. And the only people that would be allowing you to go out would be aware of your absence then. He was there all of that night, but there was a witness who said that they saw him at this convenience store committing this crime. And they say that he killed the clerk and stole and what have you. And as I said, he was charged even with the previous crimes because they thought he was the one who did this one. He must have been the one who did the other ones. And at the time, of course, and even today, unfortunately, a lot of black people in parts of this country are accused of things and have to be convicted of things that they didn't do. And it happens to white people as well, but I think the predominance is that people who are of minority status often are convicted wrongly. They often can't afford the defense that they have, and so on. Anyway, I don't need to go into that diatribe, but um, the point is that he was falsely convicted and spent all this time. Eventually, this man named Brian Stevenson, who runs a project that is all about restoring justice for those who've been falsely accused, and he offers his services free of charge. It's a nonprofit organization that provides this legal assistance. I think it was, can't remember, it's something Equal Justice or something. I can't remember the name of it right now. He's actually written a book as well about his organization and the efforts that they've made to restore justice for so many people that are falsely accused. So in I've read also the book that is the biography written by Anthony Ray Hinton that's called The Sun Does Shine, and it's really very good as well. I liked Edith Eva Eger's book better, but nonetheless, it's quite insightful too to read his recounting of his years in prison, because for most of the book he's in prison, the 30 years or so of his life that he spent behind bars on death row. Unfortunately, all the legal processes kept going long enough to keep him from actually being executed, but he watched person after person, man after man being executed that he got to know on death row. And he actually became a great source of support for them as they dealt with their own trials in life and what have you. So his biography is quite interesting, well worth reading as well. So let's go to what is actually shared in the book from that story of Anthony Ray Hinton. That gives us a flavor for how it's related a bit to forgiveness. So let's see if I can get this to go down again. There we go. So when a unanimous Supreme Court ruling finally ordered his release, he was able to walk free. And this is a quote from me. He says, "One does not know the value of freedom until one has it taken away." And apparently Douglas Abrams has met with Anthony Ray Hinton on occasion and had an opportunity to get some of these quotes from him. This is Anthony Ray Hinton again talking. "People run out of the rain. I run into the rain. How can anything that falls from heaven not be precious? Having missed the rain for so many years, I am so grateful for every drop, just to feel it on my face." So this gives a flavor for his sense of gratitude that he now knows after having gone through this 30-year ordeal. That is what is influencing this sense of forgiveness that comes up now. So Douglas Abrams says that when Hinton was interviewed on the American television show 60 Minutes, so I didn't happen to see this one, I really would like to have seen it, but he says the interviewer asked whether he was angry at those who had put him in jail. And he responded that he had forgiven all the people who had sent him to jail. So the interviewer incredulously asked, "But they took 30 years of your life. How can you not be angry?" Hinton responded, "If I'm angry and unforgiving, they will have taken the rest of my life." And this is what, again, how they are relating this to gratitude is I think it's from that space of gratitude that he can be so forgiving, because he recognizes the gratitude he has now for his freedom, for his having made it through this ordeal. That to spend his time being unforgiving and to hold on to it with great resentment would only destroy whatever time he has left. The gift that he's been given would be wasted. So Douglas Abrams says, "Unforgiveness robs us of our ability to enjoy and appreciate our life because we are trapped in a past filled with anger and bitterness. Forgiveness allows us to move beyond the past and appreciate the present, including the drops of rain falling on our face." So, I mean, which comes first, the gratitude or the forgiveness? I don't know. I think they're very much interconnected. He seems to be saying to some degree that with forgiveness, we then can have the appreciation, the gratitude for the present, for the rain on our face, for whatever it is that we're experiencing. But nonetheless, if we have the gratitude, as I explained, then if we recognize that come into that gratitude, we see that there's no room for unforgiveness. There's no point in holding on to our grudges, our resentment of other people, because that's only going to destroy what we are trying to create by having that gratefulness, by being in that space of gratitude. So I think they're very much interrelated. It's kind of an interesting topic of how those two work with each other. Maybe you can think about that a bit to discuss it even with those in the class or other people to see what their thoughts are. A quote that comes from his biography, The Sun Does Shine, is he says, "I wake up every morning," this is towards the end of the book, "grateful to be alive and grateful to be free. I'm a voice for the men still on the row. I'm a voice for justice. I'm the poster boy for all that is broken in our prison system." The story, his biography tells in his autobiography, that he went on, having been released from prison, to do work with Brian Stevenson, with his organization in Alabama and what have you, and that he is dedicated to helping others, even though at this point he's in his 60s, and he said most people would be retiring at this point. He doesn't have any retirement savings. He's been in prison most of his life. He doesn't have anything to even think that would be, a necessity to retire. He wants to use the time he has in the most meaningful way to help others who are dealing with false accusation and conviction and what have you. So, amazing story of a very courageous person who has dealt with something that, again, you and I, everyone who's listening to this, has probably never experienced that degree of unfairness, injustice in their life, and had to endure so many years of being held falsely, wrongly. So, on how gratitude connects us, the next topic. Let me once more stop it here and just see if there's any, are there any comments in anyone? Paymane's got a comment. She shared, "It seems that like many things, you have to force it before it becomes comfortable." I think so. I mean, I think, as we're learning about all these various things, either fake it till you make it is a perfectly fine way to work with all of this. We can start by just saying the words of gratitude. Stop by just, trying to bring that into our lives, albeit in a very forced way. But over time, it becomes more natural. Over time, our heart begins to open up more with all of those thoughts and words of gratitude that we express. The exercises that we're going to share at the end of this are ways to help make that more real, to make it not perhaps quite as forced. But I do agree that, like most of the things that we've been talking about, compassion, the next one that we'll get into, even generosity, these we have to do them in very uh, kind of simulated ways, or ways that are not necessarily as challenging. And eventually we will have more conviction behind it. And then another comment from Paymane, "It's easy in the basic way, but in the heavy way that you've talked about, that's another level." Yes, I mean, I'm astounded at the courage and conviction and ability for people to transcend some of these amazing, horrific experiences in their life. Like I said, that was the most inspiring thing about both of those autobiographies, both Edith Eva Eggers and Anthony Ray Hinton's, was how they took this, they'd been dealt, we have that phrase, right? When life gives you lemons, you make lemonade. Well, this was like a superior version of that. This was like so far beyond what most people have to deal with in terms of life experiences, that both of them had endured unbelievable pain and suffering and loss, and had to transcend that, had to find some way through that. Of course, we've seen other examples of that in our talking here. Viktor Frankl, who was also a Holocaust survivor. The other one that we mentioned, the Tibetans who have come out of the prison system in occupied Tibet, who have had to work with that as well. And then Mary is sharing from Venerable Amy, saying, "Venerable Amy inspired me last October. She said that the first 3 minutes you wake up, the waking moments in bed, do not look at your phone. Do not kind of, spend your time in more virtuous thoughts. Spend your time doing something that's much more meaningful." Lama Zopa Rinpoche says that every morning that we wake up, and we're of course awake at that point, we didn't die the night before, those are the first thoughts that we should have that can be really useful. If we think, "Oh my gosh, I've got another day in this human life. I didn't die last night. I have this precious opportunity again," similar to the words that I shared from His Holiness that were in the book, that we have this precious experience, this precious opportunity. And we should feel so grateful for that. So again, we have a lot of exercises. So continuing with what Venerable Amy shared according to Mary, she said, minute one, appreciate and be grateful for your life. All systems are firing. So we have that, kind of going on. And then Laura said, just curious about the kindness of the Nazi prison guard related to his giving of bread. Um, so again, kindness, yeah. I mean, it was an act of kindness to some degree. While admittedly, they're in a concentration camp, so they were kind of. It's kind of like when someone's kind to somebody in a prison, right? If a guard were kind to an inmate in the prison, they're still in prison, but it still can be seen as kindness. In Tibetan Buddhism in particular, when we talk about, and I guess in a lot of the other Buddhist traditions, when we talk about kindness, we can choose to see things as kindness, even though they may not have been intended as kindness. Why? Because we benefited from them. And of course, Edith Eva Eger in her story, um, this is the important thing, is that she knows that she benefited from the bread that Mengele gave her. The fact that he didn't kill her at that moment, that he sustained her life, and that because of that being shared with the other women that were there, one of those women recognized her, and because of that act of kindness that she had of sharing the bread with them, uh, responded in kind by helping to lift her up and get her, to be able to make it to the conclusion of that march so that she could actually be saved by the American forces that came in. So, I mean, it's interesting how things, I like those kinds of stories that show that oftentimes we don't see those connections. But she was able to discern that through her wisdom and looking back on her experience and recognize that it's her choice to see it with a lens, through the lens of gratitude, as opposed to all the ways that, of course, Dr. Mengele isn't looked upon very favorably in history because of what he did. So anyway, it is interesting. So if there's any other comments, yeah, I'd be interested at some point to hear from Mary what Venerable Amy says about the next 2 minutes. The first minute being that appreciating and being grateful for your life. But maybe we can look at that at another time. Let's go back to the slides. Oh, here we do. Here we go. Minute number 2. Appreciate, let me get out of that for a second. Appreciate your good qualities. So this is another level of appreciation, gratitude, not just this life, but the qualities that we have. Minute number 3, a very quick death meditation. And then think, if this was my last day at 6 p.m., how do I want to be on my last day? What is it that I want to do? Actively participate in your day. Let it motivate and not cripple. It helps to be skillful with your mind and more spacious. Make the most meaning out of today. Anyway, no, that's great. Thank you, Mary, for sharing that. I think this is wonderful advice, to have this appreciation, this gratitude being some of the first thoughts. Gratitude for the life that we possess, for the qualities that we have, and then a recognition that it is transitory, fleeting. And how do we want to then spend that day? Because one day it is going to be our last day. And if we don't spend that day constructively, then we will have wasted that opportunity on our last day. But it's important that we use every day in this way. So those thoughts can be very powerful. Anyway, thank you for sharing that. Um, so let's go back then to the slides and get back into the topics that are discussed here. The next topic is the connecting ability of gratitude. Back to Brother David, he says, when you are grateful, you are not fearful. And when you are not fearful, you are not violent. When you are grateful, you act out of a sense of enough, of adequacy, and not out of a sense of scarcity. And you are willing, therefore, to share. So, kind of all of these ways that gratitude breaks down the fear we might have of others, there before the attitudes that we might have of harming or being confrontative with others. Also, this ability to be in a place of enough. And we're willing then to share, to open up to generosity, which is coming up as the 8th pillar in a few classes. But nonetheless, these are kind of these positive ways that gratitude allows our heart to connect to others. In the next slide, get that up. If you are grateful, he says, this is Brother David still, you are enjoying the differences between people and respectful to all people. A grateful world is a world of joyful people. Grateful people are joyful people. a grateful world is a happy world. And I think these are, these might seem more like kind of um, exaggerations to some degree, but if the whole world, every one of us, lived with a sense of gratitude, and I certainly do see it again when I've traveled. I haven't traveled that much in Asia, but when I've been to Nepal, you can see how people have a deep gratitude for what they have, which in Western perspective is not very much. And certainly when I was there after the earthquake in 2015, it was obvious that people still had this deep joy that came from being grateful for something that, again, most of us would not look upon as a favorable life because we're spoiled. We're used to things being so much better. But you can live from that place, being grateful for whatever you have. And certainly we know that most of us, don't have the resources and what have you that many people in this world do, what we frequently call the 1% or what have you. So we know that we can be grateful for what we have. What we have is actually plenty. What we have is actually sufficient. Um, and from that place of gratitude, you have a sense of joy that you can then enjoy the differences, enjoy each other out of a sense of respect and gratitude. So, continuing, gratitude connects us all, Douglas Abrams says. When we are grateful for a meal, for example, we can be grateful for the food that we are eating, for all of those who have made the meal possible, the farmers, the grocers, the cooks, the truckers, the people who pick the food, the people who package the food, the people who, I mean, you've got so many people involved, right? And in many cases with food, you even have insects involved in cross-pollination and what have you, allowing things to grow for nuts and fruit and what have you. You have so many beings involved in our care in terms of that. When you're eating just a simple meal, you can have those thoughts of gratitude. So the last topic that's discussed in this chapter is gratitude helping us to overcome what, again, they call this negative bias. And I explained a little bit of that earlier when we introduced this topic in the list. But Douglas Abrams says, scientists have long known that our brains have evolved with a negative bias. It was no doubt advantageous for our survival to focus on what was wrong or what was dangerous, because you imagine, early humanity on the plains of the Serengeti or whatever, they needed to beware, they needed to be mindful of what was going on that was wrong so that they could correct things very quickly. That negative bias of looking for what is wrong, looking for the negative, the harmful thing, the dangerous thing, is hardwired, again, to some degree in our biology. And that bias can seep into even modern day human culture. So gratitude, he says, cuts across this default mode of the mind. It allows us to see what is good and right and not just what is bad and wrong. Remember that was one of the key elements that Robert Emmett was saying is involved in his definition of gratitude is the appreciation of the good, the ability to recognize that good and moreover recognize that that good comes from others often, that it's involved with others in creating that. Perhaps because of this negative bias, Douglas Abrams says, people are often skeptical of gratitude and wonder if it is a naive point of view or will lead to complacency or even injustice. So we might have those kinds of fears about gratitude. Is it realistic in the world that we live in? Because even though we're not on the plains of the Serengeti any longer in terms of humanity, we still are dealing with a culture and the potential for other people to take advantage of us, to harm us, what have you, to have those dangerous things in our lives that we need to be somewhat aware of. So it's kind of interesting. It does raise that dilemma, is being in this grateful space to be kind of living from a place of gratefulness, living in a dream in a sense, a naive point of view. And it might make us complacent and it might bring about more injustice in the world because we're blind to some of that perhaps in that space of gratitude. But as we're going to see, scientists have actually found the opposite. And one of them, of course, is Robert Emmett. And we'll see his name coming up soon. So he says, if we are grateful for what is, this poses that same question, will we be less likely to work for what still needs to be done? If the Dalai Lama is able to find things in his exile that he's grateful for, will he be less willing to stand up to the Chinese occupation of Tibet? So will gratitude lead to that sense of complacency or not confronting what needs to be changed in the world? UC Davis professor Robert Emmons, who we saw earlier in terms of his writings on gratitude, he's been studying it for over a decade. In one study with his colleagues, Michael McCullough and Joanne Sang, they found grateful people do not seem to ignore or deny the negative aspects of life. They simply choose to appreciate what is positive as well. So it's kind of interesting that in their studies, they haven't found that this fear becomes reality, that actually people ignore what is negative or harmful to themselves or others by being in that grateful space. In fact, it's simply a choice to be appreciating what is positive as well as recognizing what is negative and requires being addressed in order to change it. So this is, I think, a quote from Robert Emmons. Robert Emmons, he says, "People with a strong disposition toward gratitude have the capacity to be empathetic and to take the perspective of others. They are rated as more generous and more helpful by people in their social network. So they actually are seen to be advancing all of those ways of confronting what is wrong, what is unfavorable in society, by virtue of having the strength of their own gratitude. That helps them to be more generous with their time, with their energy, with their abilities to help others. So it is kind of not proving out that the negative bias would be overlooked in terms of the mind of gratitude when we have that. It goes on to say that these people who practice more gratitude are also more likely to have helped someone with a personal problem or to have offered emotional support to others. So being in a space of gratitude actually makes us much more connected to others, much more, aware of their problems and suffering and able to help others who are dealing with difficulties. So, in conclusion, Douglas Abrams says, it seems gratitude is motivating, not demotivating. Grateful people report more positive emotions, more vitality and optimism, and greater life satisfaction, as well as lower levels of stress and depression. So this touches on some of the things that we saw from Robert Emmons as well earlier. But he went on then in the book, and I'm not going to go through all these, the positive physical effects of gratitude, but we see this with so many of these positive states, compassion, kindness, love, what have you, that they decrease the problems in the body to a large degree and allow for better physical health, better well-being in not just mental capacity, but also in terms of one's body. So again, studies have shown this again and again. Research has shown that the simple act of smiling for as little as 20 seconds can trigger positive emotions, jump-starting joy and happiness. Smiling also seems to reward the brains of those who see us smiling, making them feel better too. There's a contagion to smiling, right? In San Francisco, I used to love to be walking down the streets when I lived there and just smile at people. If people make eye contact with you. When I've been in San Francisco recently, it doesn't seem that it's as open to that anymore. I don't know. But I do think there's some benefit to us smiling at people, breaking down some of those barriers. It induces joy and happiness in us. And if the other person smiles back, it induces that within them, hopefully. Or even if they don't, maybe they're getting something, by virtue of our smiling at them. But it's also important then if we do smile at others that we don't get too connected to them needing to smile back. We're just going to be in that place of inner joy and exhibiting it to others. But that also does help in our society to have more people who are walking down the street smiling. One of the things I was struck by when I was in Paris back in 2003, I was there for teachings with His Holiness. I would ride the metro there, their line, and all of the on the trains and all of that. When I looked around at the people, everybody seemed so sullen. I don't know if it's just the trains I was riding on, but people didn't have that kind of joie de vivre, as they say in France. They didn't have that kind of exuberance, and maybe it's just the heaviness of living in Paris, the day in and day out challenges of city life, urban life, what have you. But I was joyful because I was there to see His Holiness the Dalai Lama, and I loved walking around Paris and just taking it all in. And it was a real contrast in my mind. I tried to just smile at people when I could, but not everybody seemed to respond. That's just the way that it is sometimes, right? So smiling is contagious, he says, stimulating unconscious smiling in others, which in turn spreads the positive effects. Did the Dalai Lama and the Archbishop smile because they were happy, or were they happy because they smiled? It sounded like a Zen koan. Likely both were true. So we don't know, again, where do these things come from. As I mentioned, even with forgiveness and gratitude, we can say that one feeds the other, but they end up feeding each other. Our smiling makes us happy. Our being happy causes us to smile. So it's important that we take the opportunity from that place of gratitude. Again, practicing these ideas that we're looking at, especially these four of the heart, that we increase our own inner happiness, and that becomes a source of joy and connection to others. So here are the concluding thoughts on gratitude in the book, and then we'll before we do the exercises or show what the exercises practices for this are, we'll just see if there are other questions or comments. So Douglas Abrams says, impermanence, the Dalai Lama reminds us, is the nature of life. All things are slipping away. This is like that meditation that Venerable Amy says, right? The third point, the third minute, that we should spend some time thinking about how everything is slipping away. And therefore, there's a real danger of wasting our precious human life. He goes on to say, gratitude helps us catalog, celebrate, and rejoice in each day and each moment before they slip through the vanishing hourglass of experience. Kind of gives us that appreciation for everything that we have at the moment before we lose it, before it's gone. Because again, there will be one day when all of this precious life is over, when we will kind of, again, in Buddhist terms, go on to whatever our next existence is. But if we haven't fully appreciated this life, then perhaps we haven't acted from that appreciation. So perhaps it was no surprise they mentioned this woman, Sonia Lubomirsky. I don't know if that's a correct pronunciation. She's apparently, as I have in the footnote, professor of psychology at UC Riverside and author of the book, The How of Happiness. Anyway, she says that it's no surprise to her that gratitude is a factor that seems to influence happiness, along with our ability to reframe negative events into positive ones. But it's interesting because those two kind of go together, right? Because we did talk about gratitude, even being able to look at the negative things that we experience, what we normally call suffering, challenges, difficulties, and make them into something positive. Just be grateful even in those moments. That we are confronted with illness or loss or whatever it is that we don't want to experience. The final factor that Sonia found, this woman found when she was our ability to be kind and generous towards others. So it's not just gratitude that contributes to our happiness, but also kindness, generosity, which the Dalai Lama and the Archbishop, he says, saw as two separate but related pillars: compassion and generosity. These are the final two that we'll be looking at over the next two sessions. When we recognize all that we have been given, it is our natural response to want to care for and give to others. So this is the idea behind this closing part, that we do have this doorway then, which we can see that gratitude together with kindness and generosity are huge factors in helping us to have happiness. So any other comments? Someone said, I've noticed that everyone in Taos is smiling. So all the people in Taos, good. Santa Fe, I think we get a fair amount of people smiling, but I don't know that those years that I lived in San Francisco, I was quite taken with it because it seemed like wherever I walked, I could be connecting with people. Of course, nowadays we also have a lot of things that cause people not to connect eye to eye, right? Because everyone's looking down at their devices, is always kind of caught up in their phone or whatever it is. And so eye contact is rare. In fact, a friend that I have in San Francisco, she said that they actually have classes now for people to take that are in making eye contact with others. I mean, it's outrageous to me to think that we have to go to that extreme to teach people how to connect with each other with their eyes. But we often see that in restaurants, even people will be sitting around the same table and they've got their devices and they're just looking at their devices and not really connecting, talking with each other. So we have a lot of challenges to having that openness and kind of being with each other in that space of gratitude, kindness, connection. Any comments on all these points that we've talked about tonight? So someone, Laura, says, very difficult for young people to learn social skills. Yes, I think so. I think in our society now, when people think that, what it means to be social is to like be on Facebook with your friends and sharing comments and things, those are part of social skills. And obviously people don't always have the best social skills on Facebook and other, you know, Twitter and what all these various, ways of connecting. But when you're connecting in person, it's very different. And I think people do need to learn that, and it is hard for young people. So, any other comments on gratitude and what you've kind of picked up from tonight? So let's go on then to look at the exercises. Again, they are on your sheet that we've been using as the guide for this course for gratitude. Let's go ahead and go to the slides as well and take a look at those. I'll share that on the screen. The very first one, whoops, is this idea of stop, look, and go. So on your sheet it says, I'm sorry, that's the second one. Let me go to the next slide and then I'll come back to this. I need to insert this in another place. So we have the practice suggestions. The very first one, and this comes from the book. This is actually in the Book of Joy. It says, sit quietly for a few minutes each day or evening, recalling 3 things from your day for which you are grateful. And in the book, they do encourage you to use a gratitude journal, something that you set aside, a small book that you can make a blank book that you can write in these 3 things from every day. If you're not a writer, then certainly you're welcome to just recall them mentally when you do this exercise. But there's some value to writing. It kind of concretizes our thoughts in a way that just thinking about them doesn't. And we can also look back at those things. From your gratitude journal, you can reflect on all those various things that you can feel grateful for. Then what I introduced was something I found online based on knowing of Brother David and I don't know, just feeling like he's an amazing being who practices this gratitude. He's even written a book on Stop, Look, Go. It's a practice to be more mindful of gratitude in your daily life. And I want you to, if you have the time and energy, to reflect on that and to try to use it and to see if it makes some difference in terms of your feelings of gratitude. So let's look at this practice. This practice, and I'll send out even a sheet that I've done. I'll try to get that with maybe the slides from tonight to Sarah for next week so she can send those out to everyone. I thank her for sending those out for this past week. The very first moment of this is to stop. And I put them in the color of the traffic lights because it seems to make sense. Stop is red. When we see a red light, we stop. Well, in this case, we're stopping to take a moment to be still. We live our lives with such craziness, such hecticness, a lot of rush and noise and, hecticness. It's important to take a moment to be still, to kind of be in that space that causes us to pause, to be aware. With the second one, we increase that awareness by looking, by being curious about our own experience in this moment. And as Brother David said, unlike any other, every single moment is unique in terms of that moment of time will never happen again and is unlike any other moment that has ever happened. So when we are curious in that moment, he says, what are we looking at? What do we see? What do we hear? What do we feel? For what can we experience a sense of gratitude? And again, you don't need to make something up. You can just see what appears to your mind. There are so many things that we can be grateful for. Even just the fact that we're breathing in that moment, we can be grateful for, right? Then the third step, the green light of go, is to then act on the insight that comes from asking what this moment offers you and others. What seed for action is this moment giving you? How can we make our actions, our life more beautiful for ourselves and for others? These are the questions that we want to ask in that moment. So this is a really nice little practice to engage in that I would encourage you to spend some time with. And again, I'll send out, have a little sheet sent out, but you can find this online. And as I said, he's written a whole book that's about this stop, look, go practice and giving you various exercises of doing that. One more way that I like to kind of bring that to mind and work with it, though, is if this works, I'm going to try to share a little video that, let's see if I can find it. here, I'm going to share from here, but I'm going to have to change over to this other. This is a video that he put together. You can watch this online as well, but I thought it'd be kind of nice to watch it together. It's less than 3 minutes, and so it's just a little video that's been put together on the basis of this stop, look, go practice by Brother David, with Brother David's voice.
Just mute. Shouldn't be moving. They said it was over here when I looked at they said it would be here.
Can you guys hear it?
Oh, no, I can't.
I can't hear anything either.
No. Great pictures, but I can't hear anything.
I don't know if Don can hear us.
Oh,
Can't hear it, Don.
okay. Sorry, it's not working.
No.
No. Okay.
We saw it but couldn't hear it.
I see. Sorry. Well, anyway, if you, I apologize for that. I finally heard some people coming in and realized, oh, people weren't hearing it. I'm sorry. If you are interested in that video, go to gratefulness.org, which is Brother David's website, and under the resources, there's a video and a section on Stop, Look, and Go. It's really sweet. I mean, very nice way to just kind of highlight these things of how we have to stop in the moment, to be quiet, to take things in, to look, to be aware of our situation and develop some sense of gratitude, and then to go from that to act. So anyway, let's get back to where we were. All right, so any questions or comments on that, on anything that we've talked about tonight? I hope it's been useful.
Mm-hmm.
I do find myself engaging in this stop, look, go practice when I think of it. It obviously takes some mindfulness to have that awareness to actually engage in that at times. And it makes a huge difference. So, okay. The one question, do I know the book title where Stop, Look, and Go are written about by Brother David? It's called Stop, Look, Go, I think. I think that's the title of it as well. I can check really quick online at Amazon because...
It is called Stop, Look, Go. I looked it up.
Oh, wonderful. Yeah. So anyway, just so that you know that there are resources out there. And again, Brother David's got a whole nother book about gratefulness. He sometimes writes about things from a Christian tradition because that is his tradition. But I think we all can find, things to appreciate regardless of the faith tradition that we're involved in. Any other final comments for tonight? So again, I apologize for going straight through, but I just was feeling like with us all being at home already somewhat comfortable and didn't really need to necessarily take a break, and we're about 20 minutes away from where we would normally end. So you've got your 20 minutes still and can end a little bit earlier. So let's go ahead and just do some thoughts of dedication. We normally, again, at the Gompa would have our prayer books and could say all the prayers together. Let's just simply have those thoughts first of dedicating that whatever merit that we've created through being here together via Zoom tonight in our various homes and what have you, all of these thoughts that we've developed, all of the things that we've discussed and so on, may this all become the cause for ourselves and others to attain complete enlightenment so that all beings may know true joy, true peace, true happiness. And may this precious mind of bodhicitta that we are all working on cultivating day in and day out, may this continue to grow and develop and never decline in the least. Then we can think about all of our amazing spiritual guides that we have in this life. His Holiness Dalai Lama, Lama Zopa Rinpoche, Asalhita, the Lama Yeshe's reincarnation, as well as Geshe Sherab, all the other teachers that we and others have karmic connections with, including Archbishop Desmond Tutu and all the other guides from other spiritual traditions. May all of these guides have good health and long lives. And may we and others always have perfect guides to lead us on our path. Then finally, we can dedicate for anyone who we're holding in our hearts, especially those who are on the prayer list at Ksitigarbha, those who have passed away, who are dealing with obstacles or illness. We won't be able to recite all their names right now, but we'll certainly, bring to mind those beings at this time and think that we're dedicating for their welfare and for everyone else that we're holding in our hearts right now. Okay, so someone said that they're very grateful that we were able to Zoom, and I'm glad that you enjoyed this experience, because I think it is a nice option to have on nights like this when travel may be dicey, not just for me, but for some of you as well. I don't know, again, Taos doesn't seem to have gotten quite the snow that we had here, but I think it was useful to just be able to connect in this way. Okay.
Yes.
Thank you,
Donla.
All right. Thank you so much. Hopefully see you next week.
Thank you. See you next
Okay.
week.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Good night.
Thank you, John. Thank you, everybody.